Amelia Cole had always trusted trajectories more than promises. She was an aerospace navigation engineer whose entire adult life revolved around plotting thousands of micro-corrections. So a carbon fiber capsule would kiss the edge of a magnetized docking ring at 7.3 centimeters per second without shattering. Yet she had failed to notice that her own marriage was drifting off course, until the morning she found the orange envelope beneath the dog-eared recipe book in their apartment kitchen, a place her husband Mason never ventured because he viewed ovens as exotic hazards. The envelope contained a single notarized sheet, transferring every joint investment they had nurtured since graduate school into a silent holding company called Nordell Ventures, a shell she'd never heard of, and the signature beside hers was a perfect facsimile of her handwriting, right down to the 2 flared loops she made whenever the pen crossed the letters E and L, a habit her middle school teacher had once praised as ballerina strokes. The timestamp showed the document had been witnessed 3 days earlier when Amelia was presenting guidance loop upgrades in Tokyo, a continent away from the dim, private recording booth in downtown Portland, where the notary's digital seal claimed she had smiled for biometric matching. That contradiction punched an impossible hole through her reality. Mason would never forge, she thought, because forgery required audacity. He reserved for telling unfunny jokes about parabolas at cocktail mixers. Still, there it was. Black ink and cold certainty. So she called the notary's office, pretending to be a curious paralegal, only to learn that the session camera had failed, and the clerk had rubber-stamped signatures from archived datasets to expedite end-of-month quotas. Amelia shut her eyes and conjured the smell of hypergolic fuel, a trick she used whenever panic threatened to override systems checks. Then she opened a secure browser, tunneled through a friend's Antarctic research station firewall, and began dissecting Nordell Ventures. 42 minutes later, she discovered Nordell linked to an entity in Luxembourg named Terra Silence GmbH, which in turn served as equity pipeline for Helix Equatorial Resources, a defense contractor bidding to privatize low-orbit debris mitigation using kinetic harpoons, one of her own experimental patents. Mason had repeatedly called beautiful but commercially hopeless. She kept digging until sunrise bled across Brannan Street's cracked blinds. Every fresh query bloomed more evidence that her husband had spent 18 months packaging her intellectual property into anonymous subsidiaries, each a stepping stone toward selling the cumulative rights to investors whose background searches had been scrubbed clean by the same firm that handled political image laundering for disgraced officials. By 8 o'clock, her palms trembled, not with heartbreak, but with the furious thrill of configuration matrices snapping into pattern. Amelia recognized sabotage the way ornithologists recognized migratory silhouettes at dusk. She dropped 2 espresso shots into a lifeless mug, texted Mason a sunny good morning, then walked their collie, Nova, along the river as though her world were still symmetrical. Listening to seagulls quarrel over bagel halves, while she strategized an interception that would fold his deception back on itself. Mason was scheduled to attend the Maritime Launch Consortium Gala that night, a velvet and tinseled spectacle at the Sentinel Hotel, where venture partners toasted new horizons over ethically questionable caviar. He believed Amelia would be en route from Tokyo until Monday, leaving him free to charm Helix executives with polished sound bites and a quiet assurance that all proprietary hurdles were already extinguished. Instead, at 1943 hours, the ballroom doors slid open to reveal Amelia herself in a graphite evening dress that flashed silver whenever chandelier light grazed its microbead seams. Mason's smile froze like impact gel. She kissed his cheek, murmuring about flights that arrived ahead of schedule, and threaded her arm through his while scanning glass walls for any interior vantage she could rewire into confession stage lighting. During dessert, she excused herself, rode an employee elevator to the control mezzanine, and introduced a crimson USB debug key into the master projector. Within minutes, every marbled column glowed with holographic overlays of acquisition documents, Luxembourg routing slips, and a time-stamped voice memo Mason had left on a private server bragging to an associate about handing helium mining rights to Helix once the signatures settle. Gasps ricocheted like micrometeoroids. The Helix CFO paled. Board members seized their phones. An investor from Dubai cursed in 3 dialects. And Mason's champagne flute shattered against the floor as he lunged for a control tablet already locked behind Amelia's overwritten admin privileges. Security approached, but she waved them aside, stating calmly that all materials were being forwarded to federal regulators and to every engineer under non-disclosure gag with Helix. The evening's entertainment, she declared, was radical transparency. 9 hours later, Mason's access badges were revoked. The Helix bid collapsed under breach of ethics clauses, and Amelia sat on their apartment balcony watching sunrise smear gold over Willamette currents while Nova pressed her muzzle against Amelia's knee as if scenting turbulence. That should have been the end. A clean Delta Vi to push Betrayal into distant orbit, yet systems rarely obey single-stage solutions. A week passed before she discovered her Tokyo hotel room had been bugged by a subcontracted private intelligence group, tracing her unsanctioned interface patches on government satellites. Someone higher than Helix wanted uninterrupted ownership of her debris nets. An unmarked van idled outside her garage each evening, its windows black as ion soot. Strangers answered her personal email with quoted fragments from classified design schematics. Amelia realized she hadn't merely exposed a greedy spouse, but had tugged one thread woven through a tapestry of orbital profiteering, insurance arbitrage, and militarized salvage disguised as environmental stewardship. So she called Sienna Ward, her college roommate turned aerospace journalist at Vector Pulse, a woman who measured curiosity in kilonewtons. Amelia delivered a 3-hour monologue, zigzagging from Luxembourg holding structures to magnetic harpoon prototypes, and concluded by asking, "How do you feel about low Earth orbit crime noir?" Sienna laughed until she realized Amelia wasn't joking, then diagrammed an exposé that would funnel whistleblower immunity through European Space Agency safe channels, while broadcasting corporate schematics across decentralized blockchain archives. They set a countdown for release. April 12th, the anniversary of humanity's first spaceflight, Yuri's Day. In the interim, Amelia pretended life resumed. She taught graduate students why thruster misalignment magnifies over time. She forged Nova's veterinary records so the collie could accompany her to Icelandic data havens. And she played Debussy on a cracked upright piano to remind herself sine waves could still sound like mercy. Mason, deserted by investors, oscillated between pleading emails and venomous voicemails, finally threatening to sue her for defamation if she didn't surrender stolen assets, meaning patents she authored a decade before meeting him. She archived every message. 2 nights before Yuri's Day, Amelia flew to Reykjavik under an alias, carrying Nova in an airline-approved crate, and the only physical copy of her encryption keys sealed inside a hollowed lunar meteorite sample. As the plane banked over volcanic ridges dusted in snow, she watched city lights appear like scatterplots and vowed that no one would ever again use her trajectories to lance the sky for profit. At ZO 632 UTC on April 12th, Vector Pulse published the story titled "How to Wreck a Planet for Fun and Revenue," complete with annotated datasets, shell company flowcharts, and a call to engineers worldwide to sign an open declaration refusing employment with any entity monetizing orbital debris without multilateral oversight. The article detonated across scientific channels, then mainstream feeds, then congressional inboxes. Stocks linked to Helix equatorial resources cratered within hours. The Maritime Launch Consortium suspended all partnership programs pending investigation. The Luxembourg subsidiary Terra Silence filed for restructuring and quietly tried to erase its ledgers, only to find every record already mirrored across 1,000 nodes. Amelia and Nova watched from a rented cabin near Thingvellir, where tectonic plates drift apart at the speed fingernails grow, which felt poetically safe. She anticipated solitude, perhaps legal summons, perhaps nothing at all, but early that evening, a secure call pierced the alpine hush. The voice identified itself as Captain Emil Herrera of the International Orbital Debris Accord, a coalition seedling crawling from diplomatic soil watered by the very article she had helped spawn. "We're forming a civil research task force," Herrera said, "to design non-commercial remediation tech under open licensing. We need a guidance lead who understands both propulsion sympathies and corporate sabotage." We think that's you." Amelia stroked Nova's ears, staring at a horizon stitched by rifts older than her species, and felt the quiet thrill of vectors aligning. She agreed, on condition the task force operate with absolute transparency, and that all contracts include an irrevocable clause dedicating profits to universal orbital cleanup rather than weapons testing. 2 weeks later, she sat in the Accord's provisional Geneva headquarters, drafting suborbital simulation matrices beside astrophysicists who spoke 6 languages of calculus. Nova dozed under the drafting table. Mason attempted one final maneuver. He leaked selective logs implying Amelia had orchestrated the original forgery as a publicity stunt. But the metadata betrayed him, and prosecutors filed formal charges for identity fraud, market manipulation, and reckless endangerment of orbital assets. The trial drew camera crews hungry for novelty. Aerospace My Fair Lady turned Avenger, a betrayed wife who coded satellites to perform moral calculus. Amelia ignored headlines, focusing on the relentless tide of math. Delta V's, ballistic envelopes, the micro-glint hazard curves of paint flecks whirling at 8 kilometers per second. 6 months into the project, she stood beneath a cavernous cleanroom canopy in French Guiana, watching technicians in bunny suits assemble the first prototype of her open-source debris shepherd. Its nose cone bore a patch reading Nova 01, after the dog who'd steadied her heartbeat through static. She pressed her palm to the composite hull and whispered a private ritual, trajectories over promises. The launch window cracked open, a sliver of pre-dawn indigo. As boosters roared, Amelia felt the same precise stillness she sensed whenever a docking maneuver concluded. The hush after chaos, a moment when all vectors converged and reality briefly resembled the silent face of a clock without hands, the promise hour her grandmother adored. And she realized that while Mason's betrayal had been engineered to erase her legacy, it had instead mapped her onto a larger trajectory. One where personal orbits intersected with global stewardship. One where a single forged signature sparked a movement against celestial vandalism. Nova 01 vanished into cloud strata, carrying systems she designed but no longer owned, because ownership implied gates, and gates bred shadow markets. She accepted that true guardianship was messy, communal, luminous. Later, walking back toward the operations bunker, Amelia glanced at encrypted messages scrolling across her phone. Engineers from Nairobi offering sensor arrays, students in Recife volunteering code audits, retired cosmonauts donating decommissioned antenna time. Each message felt like a tiny grav burn shifting her forward. She couldn't know what new turbulence awaited. Lawsuits, lobbying, the subtle sabotage of interests threatened by altruism, but trajectory planning never guaranteed serene flight. It promised only the math to cross vacuum without surrendering to it. In that equation, Amelia Cole at last found equilibrium. Forged from ashes, plotted across stars, calibrated by the unbreakable truth that vectors, unlike vows, never lie if you respect the physics holding them aloft. 2 months after Nova 01 settled into its 610-kilometer polar orbit, Amelia checked telemetry each sunrise with the same quiet devotion other people reserve for prayer, and on a brittle February morning, the packet feed lagged by 6 seconds, then 12, then guessed its own attitude vectors with a wobble that made her pulse spike, because attitude drift in low Earth orbit was like vertigo in a mountain climber. A hint the next misstep might send you spinning into the void. She called flight operations. The console classed it as a minor quaternion discrepancy, but Amelia recognized the signature of hostile torque. Reaction wheels pushing against an invisible nudge as if the satellite were being brushed by a non-existent breeze. There is no breeze at 7.6 kilometers per second. There is only physics or malice, and physics never acts in bursty pulses timed to network windows. She requested the last 24 hours of station keeping logs and saw a pattern buried in the jitter. Regularly spaced spikes aligning exactly with encrypted ping attempts on the control bus, an intrusion so subtle it had fooled autopilot into treating them like noise. Whoever wrote the exploit understood open-source avionics intimately. Understood, in fact, the very code patches she had pushed 2 weeks earlier. She thought of Mason's final threat buried in legal briefs, then of Helix Equatorial's engineers, desperate to discredit the public benefit version of the tech they no longer owned. With a few kilobytes of corrupt command packets, they could spin-delaminate Nova 01's carbon struts, shatter its solar arrays into a blizzard of shards, then point to the wreckage as proof that altruistic engineering was naive. Images widened in her mind's eye. Plate-sized panels slicing through the Chinese weather constellation, shards peppering broadband satellites, a chain of collisions sparking the Kessler domino that would entomb Earth in metal hail for a century. She pinged Sienna, who was embedded at a European spagency policy summit, and within minutes, Vector Pulse flashed a silent alert to their private channel. Hearing rumors of sudden investor confidence in proprietary shielded constellations smells like someone betting on debris surge. Amelia convened the three-person crisis room inside the Geneva bunker. Herself, Captain Herrera, and Dr. Rhys Bauman, a Welsh attitude control savant who wore knotted scarves, even in July. She showed them the infiltration timestamps. Rhys ran a stochastic fingerprint and concluded the attack script originated from a routing enclave leased by a Panamanian trust, 2 corporate veils away from Helix's last salvage subsidiary. That placed legal blame in a limbo zone, but moral blame square on the same board that had tried to buy Mason's stolen package. Herrera's response was crisp. Cut the feed, hard cycle encryption, reboot attitude firmware. Amelia shook her head because restarting mid-orbit without ground truth alignment would freeze thrusters at the wrong bias. They'd stop the attacker, but doom Nova 01 to tumble anyway. She proposed a lunar slingshot of code, wrap the hostile intrusion into its own sandbox, and let it puppeteer a ghost subsystem, while the real one operated behind cloaked guidance math. Rhys grinned as if she'd suggested solving chess with origami. Herrera gave them 5 hours. They wrote the loop side by side, trading keyboard strokes like improvising jazz, layering decoy registers, generating synthetic noise that mirrored the attacker's handshake until it swallowed itself. At T-9 minutes, they pushed the patch into the flight queue while thousands of volunteer mirrors watched on public blockchain, every byte notarized in daylight, so no corporation could accuse clandestine meddling. The patch executed, the reaction wheels sighed back into nominal hum, and Nova 01's star tracker reacquired Polaris with a stubborn glint that felt, to Amelia, like the dog's reassuring nudge on her knee. 40 minutes later, an anonymous derivative trader attempted to short every publicly listed ComSat provider. Exchange watchdogs flagged the move and froze the account, revealing Mason's old college roommate as the broker of record. The exploit's origin story unraveled hour by hour across chat rooms, and by nightfall, Helix Equatorial's remaining C-suite resigned en masse, while subpoenas migrated through transatlantic circuits. Amelia exhaled relief but not triumph, because victory felt fragile, like maintaining laminar flow across a heat shield. She walked Nova along the Rhone, thinking of trajectories and promises again, and the dog broke her reverie by barking at river swans that hissed like steam vents. Opportunistic, territorial, but predictable if you understood their angles of attack. The next morning, she boarded a red-eye to Washington, where the newly drafted Orbital Liability Convention was waiting for her signature. She felt the document's gravity in her fingertips. 38 nations agreeing that whoever launched metal must also ensure its gentle retirement. Mason watched from the gallery. He'd pled down to mail fraud in hopes of avoiding prison, and now served as cautionary mascot for committees trying to codify the boundary between ambition and malice. Their eyes met. His held a brittle sheen that begged for absolution, or perhaps relevancy, but Amelia's gaze slid past him like a satellite ignoring atmospheric drag. She dotted the final italic flourish of her name, not with ballerina loops this time, but with the crisp architecture of a vector arrow, then tucked the pen behind her ear, an unspoken promise to shepherd the ink itself. 3 days later, Nova 01's sibling spacecraft, Aurora 02, rode a reusable booster into dusk, carrying onboard an engraved titanium disc listing every open-source contributor to the Debris Accord, from retired seamstresses who 3D printed cable ties to Kenyan high schoolers who optimized propellant burn in simulation. The disc also carried a small cavity filled with seeds from heirloom apple orchards. Amelia's grandmother once tended, sealed against vacuum, in the hope that one day orbital farms might sprout edible continuity between Earth and sky. Amelia watched the ascent live from a control deck in Kourou, her headset relaying steady telemetry, while Launchpad Thunder rattled steel beams. When main engine cutoff flashed green, she whispered to an empty seat beside her where Mason had once planned to sit as partner. Then she rubbed Nova's head. Someone had snuck the collie a special access vest so she could witness the future she'd helped salvage. The vest's patch read, Keepers of Quiet Orbits. 2 hours into coasting, Aurora 02 unfurled its magnetic net, silver struts blooming like petals designed by Euclid, and began shepherding microscopic fragments into a spiraling graveyard trajectory that would vaporize safely in 30 years. A slow solution, but physics rarely tolerated shortcuts. Reporters asked Amelia whether 30 years was fast enough, and she told them time itself was made out of patience, that every micro-correction mattered, that humans had spent 6 decades littering the sky and might reasonably spend 6 cleaning it. That night, she lay awake beneath a mosquito net on a Guianan veranda and dreamed not of harpoons or forged signatures, but of a clock without hands whose face finally warmed under sunlight. She watched its brass rim glow until it became the perimeter of Earth seen from 600 kilometers up, a horizon she could protect but never own. And somewhere in that endless ring of quiet, Amelia Cole fell asleep smiling, content that trajectories once redeemed could carry even broken promises toward the soft mathematics of hope. Below is the remaining single-piece continuation that completes Amelia Cole's story. No Arabashliklar, no intentional section breaks, and in one uninterrupted flow as you asked, it brings the total narrative a bit past the 6th, comfortably under an hour's read at normal voiceover pace. By late summer, the International Orbital Debris Accord had blossomed from a signature sheet into a bustling patchwork of laboratories, simulation suites, and field depots scattered across 5 continents, all feeding telemetry to an open ledger so transparent that schoolchildren could watch real-time plots of aluminum flakes shepherded out of the geostationary belt. On with a mixture. The first true stress test arrived on an otherwise quiet Thursday in September when the Arcadia G broadcast satellite, a 4-ton behemoth that had been asleep since 2003, belched to life on a spurious command and began venting hydrazine. The plume nudged the carcass just enough to slide it into a collision corridor aimed squarely at a NOAA weatherbird, which in turn could ricochet into the European Sentinel fleet. The math screamed cascading loss of $4 billion and a decade's Earth observation data, a smaller, deadlier Kessler stone to skip across the glassy pond of low Earth orbit. Every rescue tug was already logged for routine sweeps, but Nova 01 had enough Delta VE left for a Hail Mary intercept if Amelia could rewrite its burn schedule within the 90-minute orbital window. She sprinted across the Geneva control hall, hair pinned under a headset, Nova the collie trotting at her heels, because nobody had the heart to leave the dog alone during crises anymore. Rhys Bauman piped in from Cardiff, already spooling delta vectors, while Sienna, who had begun shadowing Accord Ops for a follow-up exposé, perched above the pit clacking notes into her recorder. Amelia's patch required tricking the satellite's own field coils to act as shift electromagnets, essentially turning Nova 01 into an orbital lasso that would draw Arcadia G just off the NOAA glide path, and then slingshot the corpse into a disposal orbit where drag would chew it to powder within 12 months. Elegant in concept, murderous in precision. If her timing slipped by 2 seconds, Nova 01 would tear open like a tin can under a can opener's bite. Herrera authorized the maneuver over encrypted channel, his voice shredded with static from a Situation Room submarine cable outage no one had predicted. 52 minutes later, when Nova 01's reaction wheels bit against the torque and telemetry displayed the capture arc in green, the entire hall exhaled loud enough to vibrate ceiling ducts. Arcadia G slid away from WeatherSat crosshairs, NOAA remained intact, and the global news feeds that Sienna had set to auto-refresh screamed, "Breaking! First full-scale debris rescue under open-source protocol." Stock markets that morning, primed by hedge fund rumors of a Kessler event, reversed their panic trades, and for the first time, Amelia watched capital surge toward transparency instead of secrecy. She allowed herself half a smile. Victory smelled like hot aluminum and long cooling coffee. That evening, she swung by the small holding cell in Geneva, where Mason awaited final extradition decisions. He had already confessed to identity fraud, but prosecutors wanted him to testify on record against Helix executives in exchange for a drastically reduced sentence. Amelia found him in a room lined with gray acoustic foam, alone except for a pilot pen and a leather legal pad. The old mathematician's spark was gone, replaced by the jittery resignation of a gambler forced to fold after the river card. He looked at her with a softness so uncharacteristic she wondered whether the security lights were playing optical tricks. "They want me to become the star witness," he said. "Suddenly everyone needs the idiot who stole code to explain why he did it." "You did it for money," she said, more gently than she intended. "That's the headline." He tapped the pen against knuckles. "But if you dig deep, I did it for relevance. You were always the trajectory. I was just ballast with a slide deck. They promised I could finally be the thrust. Turns out you can't fake propellant." She remembered how he used to scribble acceleration curves on cafe napkins and dream aloud about lunar telescopes. Ambition in his hands had mutated into hunger. She felt no urge to forgive, but indulged a moment of empathy. Everyone wants gravity to notice them. "Tell the truth in court," she said. "Tell it without spin. Then start writing the guidance code that keeps school bus debris from trashing Ecuador's network. You still know the math." "Would you ever trust anything I write?" "I'll trust code reviews and peer audits. Same as I trust myself." She placed Nova's paw briefly against the table, so he could see the dog's steady eyes, then walked away before nostalgia could skew her vector. The trial unfolded across 3 jurisdictions over 5 taut months. Mason delivered testimony so technically meticulous that defense lawyers surrendered cross-examination after half a day. Helix was fined into dissolution and its board banned from aerospace for 15 years, an eternity in orbital economics. Mason served 6 months house arrest under full-time supervision, then petitioned to join an Accord research spinoff that tested near-zero thrust electric sails. Amelia neither endorsed nor opposed the request, leaving trust to the algorithms designed to detect sabotage. When the Oversight Committee approved him, she felt a flicker of something like stoic relief. Trajectories did not have to be linear to redeem themselves. Sienna's follow-up article, Guardians of the Quiet Orbits, vaulted across cultural borders, inspiring a rash of high school robotics teams to tackle micro-debris capture as though it were as glamorous as Mars rovers. Japanese manga artists drew heroic characters in magnet suits wrangling junk satellites. A Norwegian pop star named her synth album Perigee. For Amelia, the public enthusiasm was thrilling but also fragile. Enthusiasm could pivot to outrage with a single media hiccup. She channeled the attention into open course modules, recorded free webinars from a converted shipping container near the Geneva marshalling yard, and taught 10,000 strangers why a 1-centimeter bolt carried the kinetic punch of a hand grenade at orbital speeds. Near year's end, the Accord received an invitation from the People's Republic of Timor-Leste, one of the smallest UN member economies, asking whether the coalition could assist in launching a CubeSat network to monitor illegal fishing fleets. Claptrap, once reserved for giant telecom portfolios, was now effectively open-sourced. Amelia flew to Dili, found herself eating cinnamon coffee with 7 Timorese undergraduates in a classroom the size of her old Portland kitchen, sketching antenna arrays on a chalkboard that still smelled like 1978. She realized then that the slow, methodical ethos of the Debris Accord was radiating outward, vector geometry seeded into geopolitical justice. Returning to Geneva, she stepped off the red-eye to news that Nova 01 had reached its designed fuel reserves. Orbital operations would shift it to a longer solar synchronous orbit where it could monitor future Shepard drones but not execute heavy intercept burns. A final mission remained. Shepard one more dangerous shard cluster, 8 kilometers above the International Station's path. The control team argued for deploying Aurora 02 or waiting for Aurora 03, still under assembly. But Amelia studied the risk tables, felt the old engineer's itch, and made the only decision her gut allowed. Nova 01 would finish its life shepherding the cluster, then gracefully deorbit over the South Pacific Safe Disposal Zone. There was poetry in letting the pioneer craft sweep its own shop floor, as Riss put it. On the last scheduled burn window, Amelia suited up in a telemetry bay lined with LED maps. She planted Nova on a blanket at her feet. Geneva Protocol insisted no animals in flight control, but nobody had the heart to object this time. At H0002, Nova 01 fired its microthrusters, guiding the shard cloud into capture range. Amelia's thumb hovered over a manual override toggle, even though the autopilot's AI predicted collision probability under 0.3%. At T plus 184 seconds, a solar wind gust nipped the net's trailing edges, but compensation algorithms flexed perfectly, and the shards corkscrewed into the net's containment funnel like fireflies spiraling into a jar. Applause rattled the speakers. Amelia closed her eyes so hard she saw constellations. 29 minutes later, the craft executed a perfect braking burn to lower perigee. 12 orbits after that, contact blacked out over the South Pacific. Nova 01's sensors kept burbling down to the moment its heat shield peeled away, and Atlantic fishermen watched a streak carve the night, dissolving before it could breed new fragments. Amelia whispered goodbye in the silent gap, choking on gratitude and the sudden absence of telemetry, clicks she'd woken to for nearly 2 years. Sienna's story that night headlined Nova 01 dies a clean death. Heroic satellite proves junk can be graceful. Life folded into softer trajectories. Amelia taught semester residencies in Nairobi and Vancouver, drafted a policy paper on culture-neutral terminology for orbital stewardship, because countries that hadn't launched yet bristled when called emerging debris stakeholders, and adopted a second rescue collie named Vector. Nova tolerated the puppy with dignified patience. Mason, monitored under conditional parole, submitted 3 peer-reviewed propulsion algorithms that passed muster and earned co-author credit. He would never be her partner again, but in the open-source tree, his grafted code bore fruit. 3 springs after the Accord's birth, Amelia returned to her grandmother's farmhouse, now a community workshop for high school coders. The frozen clock above Nana's desk had been repaired by a 10-year-old who disassembled the brass gear train, printed a new escapement wheel, and fitted a quartz driver tuned exactly to the Greenwich signal. At 11:11, the hands aligned with fresh intention, no longer stuck but purposeful, and the kid grinned, saying, "Time was tired of standing still." Amelia laughed, placed her palm against the warm glass, and felt her grandmother's wisdom pulse through the brass. Stories are keys, yes, but stories also need caretakers willing to rewind them. That night, under Texan stars, she unrolled a portable fiber dish and streamed Aurora 02's live feed on a bedsheet for a crowd of local farmers, mechanics, toddlers with sticky fingers. They watched silver specks bloom against velvet black, shepherding glitter motes away from climate satellites that forecast rainfall for those same cotton fields. Someone asked if the sky ever felt too heavy with junk to bother saving. Amelia answered simply that the sky was their oldest commons, older even than land deeds and irrigation ditches, and that a commons survived only when every user remembered they were also its caretaker. The dog Nova barked at a passing owl. Vector barked in sympathy. Laughter rippled. In that moment, the trajectory that had begun with an orange envelope and a forged signature now arced through 1,000 new hands, tinkering with open schematics, through fishermen protected by clean sensor networks, through children reciting star catalogs free of corporate lock-in. The promise hour had stretched from myth to mechanics, from personal revenge to planetary maintenance. Amelia Cole tucked the old brass clock into her backpack. It would hang in the Geneva control room as a reminder that time is a vector, too, and set her shoes toward whatever door needed unlocking next. Confident that the keys she carried were now too many to fit in any single pocket, because they lived in code repositories, in legal precedents, in the quiet roar of solar sails, and in every heartbeat, stubborn enough to plot a cleaner path across the heavens.